So excited to have everyone here for our first Blue Carbon Mastermind. It's actually the first mastermind of any of the chapters of the Cooperating Manual for Spaceship Earth. This is a historic week. We are gathering publicly for the first time around the Cooperating Manual after working on it behind the scenes with our team for about a year and a half now. And yeah, it's the co-operating manual. So we're really looking for co-operators to come and help us co-create and co-design this manual so that it can be reflective of our collective intelligence. And we'll be getting into some of those questions later on. And yeah, today we're gathering around blue carbon, which is about balancing our Earth's carbon system and cycles by looking at ocean and coastal ecosystems. I really enjoy the flip of thinking about oceans as kind of a superhero in the story of climate change, whereas to date they've been really kind of seen as the damsel in distress, as they are too. There's a lot of stress on the oceans in this climate chaos system that we're in and climate collapse that we are hurling towards, but can avoid. And I think one of the things that really struck me the most when I started thinking about blue carbon and with some of the research that we did with Kevin Bayuk, who'll be on in a minute, is about this idea that there's a terminus or there's an end to the carbon cycle in the oceans. So carbon really loves to cycle. Carbon, I like to say, is the element that holds hands and collaborates. It really likes to link up with other elements. And it likes to cycle and kind of turn into different things. But in the deep ocean, the carbon just sits and rests and doesn't turn into other things. And so in this moment where we have 1 trillion excess tons of CO2 in the atmosphere that we need to bring and get to bring back into life, doing so in the oceans makes a lot of sense because it kind of dwells there a lot longer than most places on Earth. So I'm just going to give a little bit of background on the cooperating manual, and then we get to hear from Kevin Bayuk about blue carbon and get into some of the content. And then from there, we'll have some time for Q&A and another breakout to discuss more. So Buckminster Fuller created the operating manual for Spaceship Earth in 1969, and here we are about 50 years later. His was not an operating manual so much as a provocation about why don't we know how to operate this perfectly designed living spaceship Earth that has all of these amazing life control, life resourcing functions. And so here we are 50 years later, we think it's about time that we have a manual. And because it's 2021, it's not just going to be a book, though we are looking to publish along the way, but it'll be an online community, really, and resource repository, kind of a knowledge commons, if you will, that gathers all the incredible resources that we need in order to do this flip that we're in. We call it the Design Science Decade, this 10-year period that we have, what a lot of people are calling the decisive decade, in order to make the world work for 100% of humanity. And yeah, as Bucky said, and his rally cry that I think is so pertinent right now is we are called to be architects of the future, not its victims. And I think so much of the framing around environmental messaging, rightfully so, because it is alarming, but has been fear-based and has been, you know, let's avoid this future that totally sucks. Whereas, you know, we can also step into this future that's incredibly, you know, full of thriving and life and healing and actually doing the deep work of reconciliation and reparations and some of the stuff that we talked about earlier this morning in the plenary session. And so here we are in the midst of all of that social and environmental change, and the operating manual, a co-operating manual, is really meant to be this doer's manual. So we have a bias towards action. So we're, you know, taking this comprehensive view, you know, first looking at blue carbon as our first chapter of kind of taxonomizing and putting all these different resources together. And essentially it's about creating positive visions of the future. So my nonprofit that I co-founded previous to this is Project Drawdown, and Kevin Bayuk is on the core team there. And the idea behind that and the idea behind this is very similar. It's that we need to be able to see that which we want to walk towards. So if you look in psychology, they call it the availability heuristic. There's also a a cognitive bias called the availability cascade, but it's essentially that which we have available, the examples that we have available in front of us are easier for us to walk towards and to create. And so, you know, there's a lot of different thinkers that have thought about similar things, but once we have these positive visions of the future, we have names for it, we have pathways, then we can kind of go down that route with more ease and more collaboration. So Buckminster Fuller, with his original design science decade, which was in the 60s, cataloged, did this incredible inventory of world resources, human trends and needs. And it was actually out of that process that he discovered that we have the technological capability of taking care of everyone on the planet at a higher standard of living than any have ever known. And so the cooperating manual kind of mimic those documents and catalog this diversity of resources, whether that's articles, media frameworks, case studies, all the different tools that are out there to help humanity do this spontaneous cooperation that we often spoke about. And so he cataloged things like the Earth's biosphere. We can put the link in the chat here. You can go through the original Design Science Decade documents. There's so much gold in there. And like those, and the cooperating manual is kind of taking this conversations that are happening on the periphery, on the edges, and trying to bring them into the center as more and more people are waking up to the change that's needed in the world and bringing their will and their power to it. We want to make it easeful for those who have been in this conversation for decades to be able to kind of resource those who are just coming to it and not have to redo the problems and the mistakes that were had. So much of this work has been kind of a whack-a-mole mode of like put out a problem and then 10 more come back up because we haven't looked at root causes. And so a lot of this is rooted in systems change and looking at Buckminster Fuller's work of comprehensive anticipatory design science. So we have a bias towards action at BFI. So we just started with a prototype and Airtable. This is really far away from what we want it to look like, but we're trying to learn by doing. So this is the very beginning. We have 200 resources. The idea here is also to create a folksonomy. So we'll have a taxonomy of tagging system where there'll be multi-tags, but a folksonomy is this idea of a co-created taxonomy system that enables multiple users to go in and say, these are the tags that I think are relevant. And then from that emerges kind of a collective taxonomy, folksonomy, like folk. And yeah, so that's what we're playing with now. The blue carbon chapter, when we created that, we didn't have the Airtable piece. So we used Kumu map because we also wanted to have kind of that forced graph feel where like once you click in on one resource, kind of the graph around it moves and you can see what the relation is to other resources and you can find new connections that way. We're also looking at Vortex 7 Vortex as another way to look at kind of the spatial relation between resources. So that's a little bit of where we are now. Lots to get into. We're gonna have our co-operators Convergence, which is our weekly meeting every Tuesday at 11 a.m. Is that right? Right? Okay, Tuesday at 11 a.m. going forward. And yeah, we'll be discussing things like governance. Yesterday we had Arthur Brock from Holochain help us think through what are some of the governance and currency systems that we can use to reward cooperation and really make this a unique project, unlike anything that's been done before in terms of its co-creation. So we're really here to pass the baton over to you and work with one another and are open to any and all ideas. So that's that. If you have questions. So time to dive into blue carbon. Again, just so excited about this work. It's really so much untapped potential. I think it's an industry where kind of similar to renewable energy was maybe 30 years ago, or regenerative agriculture was maybe 10 or so ago. Blue carbon has so much latent potential, and I think will move way faster than either of those industries did because of the need and also because the solutions are so vast and there's so many to work on. So Kevin Bayuk helped us do some deep research about a year and a half ago on this. And we are just so honored to partner with Lift Economy, which is Kevin's organization. Kevin has a background in both entrepreneurship and permaculture and ecological design. He started and ran a bunch of different tech companies, and then now is kind of blending those two things together in order to help entrepreneurs work in a nature-inspired and nature-cooperative way. And yeah, he's just working on so many incredible projects. Thank you, Kevin, for all you do and for joining us today and giving us a deep dive into blue carbon.
Thank you, Amanda, and thank you all for being here. All the many things you could do with your life energy today to be here to learn about blue carbon, discuss it, and activate together. I'm grateful to your presence, to you for your presence. I'm going to go ahead and share some images, but I'm very open to interruption or questions as we go, in addition to Q&A at the end. And I might ask some questions to y'all as we go. And some of it, if it moves too fast or too slow, I can adjust the pace. Let me go ahead and share my screen here. Okay. And does that get you the images or the presenter view? Is that looking okay?
Yeah. We're still seeing this top of your screen, but it looks great.
Okay, great. So blue carbon, I mean, first of all, like what does blue carbon mean as a term? And it kind of first appeared in print in like 2009. Grid Arendal created this thing called the Rapid Response Assessment, looking at the plight of our oceans. But since that time, the term blue carbon has been studied and elaborated. And last time I checked, over 9,000 academic papers in the scientific literature have been published since 2009. So blue carbon definitely has a lot of attention and is very important, but that still doesn't necessarily tell us exactly what it is. So I want to dive in a little bit deeper and kind of go through some of the kind of key understandings and principles. And I'll make some distinctions so that we can have a kind of collective sense making around what is blue carbon? What do we mean by that? But in terms of principles, one thing to note with that like explosion of study and paper, the research is still emerging. So there's a lot of things that we'll talk about today where instead of being finite and fixed and all well known, there's still a lot of emerging discovery. There's more science, there's more multiple ways of knowing and understanding. That the impact of blue carbon was happening in the ocean on planet water. So one thing I could pick a bone with Bucky about is, Spaceship Earth. It could be Spaceship Water, and if we're really being honest, because it's the only place we really know that has so much water, and 80% of our planet, somebody said, is water. 80% of our bodies is water. It's the limiting factor to life. All those things. Okay, so Spaceship Water. But the impact on our oceans really does start on the land. So I want to come back to that. Coastal communities are kind of the key to blue carbon. We'll talk about that. There's, in terms of the order prioritization, conserve first, protect the existing blue carbon stores. And I'll describe what that means before we restore and or create new ecosystems. And then there's lots of cascading and co-benefits. So it's blue carbon, but we don't want to reduce the story of the ocean to carbon, because obviously there's so much more in terms of our human partnership and the biospheric partnership with the ocean. And then partnering with biology. Biology is going to be the magic. That's where the magic happens. Okay, so oceanic blue carbon versus coastal blue carbon. So most times if you talk to somebody and say, I'm talking about blue carbon, they're probably thinking about three things. Does anybody know what kind of the three ecosystem types that are mostly associated with blue carbon? Somebody want to name one, or maybe in the chat?
Mangroves?
Mangroves, that's definitely one of them. Mangroves is one.
Seagrass.
Seagrass is another. And salt marshes are the third. So and those are all coastal blue carbon. Over the last, say, 4 years, on the coastal blue carbon side, we've also been reading more, and there's been more talk and study and analysis of kelp and macroalgae ecosystems. So coastal blue carbon, mangroves, seagrass, salt marshes, and kelp. So we'll talk about those as coastal blue carbon. Oceanic blue carbon, as a distinction, is a whole emerging world of study and analysis with some familiar characters that we'll talk about. But why does it matter is basically carbon sequestration rates, especially in coastal blue carbon, exceed by 30 to 50 times the carbon sequestration rates in the soils in many terrestrial ecosystems, including tropical rainforests. So you have maybe up to 5% of current CO2 emissions from fossil fuel combustion is actually absorbed, sequestered by blue carbon ecosystems. And it's estimated that's a pretty broad range here, but 41 to 278 teragrams of carbon per year of carbon released into the atmosphere by humans. It comes from the disturbance and degradation of blue carbon environments. So if you forget all else from anything I shared today, remember that our priority actually is to conserve and preserve the intact blue carbon ecosystems, the mangroves, the seagrasses, the existing kelp. We need to conserve and preserve what exists today, because we're actually, the potential is to lose more, to create more emissions from disturbing those ecosystems than even if we revitalize and restore and create new ecosystems. Okay. So the ocean as this protector, the mother, the source, and just real quick, like literacy of like the carbon cycle and the ocean. The ocean interacts with carbon in a lot of different ways, but it definitely plays an outsized role. And so the big store of carbon from all the emissions that humans have caused basically becomes dissolved inorganic carbon in the ocean. That's the largest store. And so the ocean has basically been protecting us. There's this big delay factor. If we had to feel the actual heat being trapped from the emissions that we've generated as humans over the last, especially over the last 150 years, it would be a lot hotter right now. The ocean has been absorbing and protecting us by creating bicarbonate from the interaction of the atmosphere and the ocean. But it's also true that there's something called the biological pump or the biological system. So a certain amount of the carbon from CO2 in the atmosphere gets, there's photosynthesized. So marine phytoplankton and other marine microorganisms really perform about half of photosynthesis on Earth. So that's 50 petagrams of carbon per year. But only about 1%, a tiny fraction of that photosynthetic carbon capture, if you will, actually sinks below the depth where it doesn't get remineralized or respired or consumed or basically get emitted back into the atmosphere. So about 1% is still a large number with 50% of all photosynthesis happening from marine microorganisms. So that's maybe half a petagram of carbon per year at the top end of the analysis. But that tiny fraction that sinks to the bottom is a very key component to understanding how the ocean works. And so there's a lot of strategies around how do we increase the photosynthetic capacity, or how do we make it so that more of what is photosynthesized, more carbon actually sinks below that line. And that's where oceanic carbon has become an exciting area of research. And there's a number of different terminology here. I won't go through them all, but some of them are very fascinating. But basically the food webs in the ocean, including the action of fish and whales, as examples, actually create more potential for either increased photosynthesis, so more primary production, or more sinking, more of the material actually sinking down to the deep ocean floor where it becomes sequestered for many eons. Of note, with those people who are interested in the ocean and our precious ecosystems there, coral, where it's extraordinarily charismatic and does deserve humanity's attention because of the disturbance that we've been creating in the coral ecosystems. When you look at the chemical equation that describes the calcification, it kind of clearly shows that for each mole of carbonate precipitated into coral, 1 mole of dissolved CO2 is actually released into the water. What that means is coral, unfortunately, is not necessarily a carbon sink. It actually is a carbon emitter, a CO2 emitter. That said, coral provides the habitat for these pelagic communities. So something like 50% of all fish that exist trace their source back to coral and seagrass ecosystems. And so without those ecosystems existing, then we won't have the fish. And we've just noted from the oceanic blue carbon that fish are critical in our blue carbon kind of analysis. Okay, I'm going to go a little bit faster here, but coastal blue carbon is where most of the attention on blue carbon. And again, when most people talk about blue carbon, they're talking about mangroves and seagrass and salt marshes and kelp. And you have dramatic carbon burial rates in storage. And I guess the thing that I would take away when I think about these ecosystems, these coastal blue carbon ecosystems, is that the carbon actually comes from things like seagrass and mangroves growing and photosynthesizing carbon into the biomass, but they also trap biomass that comes off the land. So as carbon comes off the land in the root systems and in these shelves, the carbon actually gets kind of captured and buried. And the one thing about terrestrial carbon, if you studied, like if you geek out on terrestrial carbon in forests and grasslands, you'll find that there's this level where it's like a saturation. The soil can only hold so much. What's amazing about blue carbon is there is no upper limit to carbon saturation because there's so little dissolved oxygen, there's so little respiration in oceanic soils, if you will, that there is no upper limit on carbon saturation. This is very important for long-term carbon storage as long as we protect these ecosystems. I just want to call out that in the terms of there's a lot of science and study, the other ways of knowing that are equally valuable, the indigenous ocean communities, coastal communities have mariculture practices that have protected and enhanced both from a carbon perspective, but the biology and the life-serving capacity of these ecosystems for eons. And so almost everything that I might share about taking action in blue carbon can be referenced from and learned from the lived wisdom of indigenous coastal communities. So just want to call that out. Going to kind of just leave this as a reference point and skip over it a little bit for time. I'm also going to skip over that chart for time, more of an eye chart. And focus on where the cooperating manual kind of focused on a couple of key ecosystems. So we definitely looked at mangrove restoration, mangrove conservation, seagrass restoration, ocean farming with macroalgae and kelp, and then some provocative new emerging potential action areas in blue carbon. One is this fairly interesting idea of mangrove creation, which I put at the far edge of our imagination, and then the valorization and the importance of whales and the whale pump, which is, we have an emerging understanding of the importance of whales. Obviously, they're beautiful, majestic allies and partners in our life system, but it turns out that they have a critical role in the potential to enhance carbon sequestration in the ocean. I'm just actually watching the time. So actually, Faith, Amanda, just look for an indicator. Just a few more minutes, or I have a couple more images, but I don't want to run over.
Yeah,
I know
you have more time. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. So looking at mangroves. Okay, so of all the blue carbon ecosystems, mangrove have the largest potential for carbon loss. So the existing mangrove ecosystems, which are mostly in the subtropical and tropical zones of the planet, are currently, there's 6 petagrams or so of carbon stored. And so there's a huge amount of risk. Mangroves are at risk due to shrimp farming, other aquaculture practices. They're at risk due to coastal development, so dredging. And they're also at risk, though they have a mitigating effect because of sea level rise. So the thing about mangroves is that the cost of protecting a hectare, the average cost of setting up a protection zone is estimated at $232 per hectare. And the cost of annually managing and maintaining an existing mangrove ecosystem is about $25 per hectare per year. So it's pretty low cost for something that's so important for humanity. And when you think about the costs, I just want to point out that, for example, the Matang Mangrove Forest Reserve in Malaysia has been managed by the local population, and with systemic management that was planned and designed by the local population since 1904. So it's 40,288 hectares of a riverine mangrove forest. And the forest is actually harvested for wood, for pole timber and charcoal production, and for some aspects of silviculture, so actually just the timber. And the wood is harvested sustainably at 17 tons per hectare per year, over a 30-year rotation cycle. So just because we're protecting a mangrove doesn't mean that we're not interacting with it for human needs and serving human needs, and actually allowing for the regrowth and the regeneration, and because the saturation limit at the soil is unbounded. So mangroves have this beautiful potential to be in partnership. So when I say protection, I don't mean put a fence around it and never humans touch it. I mean coastal communities, especially indigenous communities of place, frontline communities, can interact with these ecosystems for food and materials and for human economic yields, still maintaining the viability and the regenerative capacity of these ecosystems. So just highlighting that as a principal approach.
And then Isaac asked a question in the chat. Was
Please.
it $25 a hectare per month?
Per year to protect ongoing management protection estimated cost. And so one of the ocean strategies for blue carbon with seagrasses or mangroves in particular, or salt marshes, is actually setting up marine protected areas, coastal marine protected areas. There's a cost of establishing them and then maintaining them. And I believe this is an important thing for humanity to consider with the value of these ecosystems, which is almost incalculable in terms of the biologic value, but then the carbon value, $25 per hectare to protect these ecosystems once we've set up a protection zone, and that money going to frontline resources. I mean, obviously, I would advocate that it should be more, that we would want to remunerate these protectors, these coastal communities. Okay, seagrass. Seagrass is basically, think of it as a mix of species of grass that grow underwater, essentially, and close to the shore. And they're amazing. The sequestration rate, currently average 1.38 tons of carbon per hectare per year. And some of the material breaks off in storm events and big waves and so forth, and actually washes out to sea. And that's where it gets stored away for long-term carbon. So that happens true of mangroves as well, but seagrass is more. 20% of the world's fisheries are reliant, of the world's largest fisheries are reliant on seagrasses. Turns out seagrass restoration is a place for innovation. If you want to take action and you love the ocean and you love this idea of seagrasses, actually learning how to restore and propagate seagrasses, turns out there's not a lot of sophisticated and programmatic science on it. There's a few projects out there that exist, but for example, one of the most elaborate ways to do it, the cost of restoring seagrass per hectare, we came up with an average based on all the literature of $383,672 per hectare. WTF? How is that possible? And the reason that it costs so much is that a lot of these are one-off. And it's actually, if you take the loss rate, there's a high loss rate. The median survival rate is about 38%. So innovation on how do we restore seagrass at a higher survival rate at a lower cost. We have seen people using jute sacks, burlap sacks, with seagrass plugs embedded and dropping them off the back of a boat with weights within the sacks. At a cost of about 16,000 per hectare, $16,000 per hectare, which is a fraction of that other cost, starting to be successful. But I would encourage you, if you want to take action and you feel like you're into research of that type and develop pilot projects, seagrass restoration is a key one. Macroalgae, I could talk about. Oh, good, go for it.
On the seagrass side of things, I think the number that we found was that it, in some cases, holds 43 times more carbon than a tropical rainforest, a seagrass ecosystem. So just in terms of the importance of conserving the seagrass meadows that are already out there, that's another one. And once again, one of the ways to conserve that the best is to look at these kind of mega kind of predators that we used to see them at the top of the food chain, but are actually these representatives of the trophic cascade. So actually protecting sharks, which kind of protect the seagrass, enables this whole trophic cascade of benefit, kind of similar to how whales support their whole ecosystems, or the wolves in Yellowstone do the same. So good story there to tell. Yeah, and we have about 4 or 5 more minutes for this.
Great. The other seagrass megafauna is a lot of our leatherbacks and the sea turtles feed on the seagrass. Is herbivorous type, very charismatic allies in the ocean. Okay, so kelp. Gosh, talk about charismatic environments. Kelp reforestation is going to be a key. Coastal macroalgae stands sequester carbon when they grow. And there's new research even over the last year, even since this is one thing about the cooperating manuals, is an evolving collaboration, right? And so as the data changes, when we publish the first chapter, the cooperating manual, it may say in there something like 30% of net primary productivity of kelp actually gets exported to the deep ocean. The revised estimate is somewhere between 8 and 11%, just so everybody knows and is tracking. But that's the idea of a cooperating manual, is we can continually update it as we learn more information. So there's action to be taken there in terms of research. But there's a lot of opportunity for ocean farming with reasonably low startup costs and a whole plethora of material economic needs and yields from harvesting the macroalgae, from human food to material for compost and soil amendment, to bioplastics and other uses. And a lot of those are emerging. And there's organizations like Green Wave, a BFI, a prize winner, as an example of an organization to follow who's doing some of this great work. I wanted to call out on the provocative idea. If you're thinking about envisioning radical futures, this ISAS, the Integrated Seawater Agriculture Systems, there are certain places in the world, and this is a very place-based approach, as many things are, where there are coastal deserts where you could actually bring saline water, not just through the action of sea level rise, but literally dredge water inland and create halophytic or salt tolerant mangrove-like, especially in tropical desert type environments, actually create mangrove ecosystems where they did not already exist. So this is neither protecting mangroves nor restoring mangrove ecosystems. This would be creating, some might call it geoengineering. But there's a couple of organizations that are doing the Seawater Works, and others are doing some of these projects. There's some pilot projects in Eritrea. And there's a vision for one in California, connecting the Salton Sea to the Sea of Cortez, which is very provocative. But the data from Eritrea is showing about 1 petagram of carbon per year, if you extrapolate to 130 million hectares of area where this might have the potential to be utilized. And there's a lot of salt tolerant species, including mesquite, prosopis, or different acacia that could be also grown along the margins and provide food for humans and for ruminants and other allies. Okay, just can't kelp myself here I'd be remiss if I didn't mention whales and the biomixing potential. So whales, we had to do some extrapolation, and the science is still emerging, but you'll see some very interesting data about the carbon contribution and the value of whales. And without a doubt, if we had pre-commercial whaling populations of, for example, 120,000 sperm whales that go so deep, the deep diving whales, they both mix the ocean in terms of mixing the carbon to allow for additional fall, but they also bring minerals, especially through whale poop, and through their action, they bring other, especially metals, to the surface that facilitate photosynthesis in places in the ocean where there's not enough nutrient for blue carbon. So whales have a very important role to play in the continuation of the human experiment. So protecting whales and recognizing their value is really important. And as the saying goes, if we protect whales, the consequence of us protecting whales means we're going to have to protect large areas of the ocean. And this whole movement towards marine protected areas, even by assembling certain protected areas, allows for the possibility of a sustained and regenerative, abundant fish, whether it's for human food and for sustaining coastal populations. There's a whole strategy where if we protect areas, we can both protect the whales as well as meet human economic imperatives for like sustenance. I'll stop there. There's more we could say about the cooperating manual, just as Amanda mentioned, the Kumu map has a tremendous number of resources, including funding. So understanding who is funding and what are the gaps and strategies along the blue carbon ecosystem. So in the cooperating manual, you'll find all of the terms that I've kind of covered at a very superficial level, described in depth with many resources. And you'll also see more insight as to who is involved today. And you'll see opportunities for action along that spectrum.
Excellent. We'd love to open up for questions here. You can raise your hand or just, if you have a question, feel free to ask it.
Hey, Kevin.
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead. I've already talked.
No, just a quick question about this. One of your last slides, when you showed this, using the salt water ecosystems.
Yes.
I was just wondering, is there a practical use for that? Like, what's the practical application in addition to the creating of ecosystems for humans?
Yeah, the integrated seawater agriculture systems with the pilot projects in Eritrea, a couple in Mexico and one in Egypt. What can be grown in those ecosystems could be halophytic, salt-tolerant species. So that could be in certain environments, mangroves, which again could be harvested for timber, food, bee forage, multiple human economic yields in addition to the carbon sequestration. But also there's an amazing plethora of emerging halophytic plants that I think are worth humans' attention. This is at kind of the cutting edge of innovation, but Salicornia, the pickleweed plants, there's a whole genera, numerous species that make human food for goats, cattle, so ruminant feed that could be grown in very salty conditions, as well as there's new rice cultivars that have been developed that are halophytic or can grow in very saline environments. And so for desert areas that don't have enough fresh water for agriculture, but are near coastal environments and are food insecure, which is amazingly mind-blowing to me, about 130 million hectares worth of area. That's the prioritization for this ISAS type stuff, Dimitri, but it's definitely not everywhere. This is very location specific.
And
right. Great, thank you.
What are sort of like, are there negative consequences in this integrated seawater system, or why are they only pilot projects? Why hasn't this been scaled?
Well, let's see. That's a great question, Kelly. And I think they're considered very provocative because anytime we're creating large scale new novel ecosystems that didn't exist before, for example, dredging, the upfront cost of dredging to allow for seawater infiltration is considered a pretty big environmental imposition. And now we could argue that the consequences are beneficial to life, but it's still not a small tweak or a small move, and it's certainly not as easy as conserving something that exists or restoring something that was from our human. So a lot of people will put ISAS in the category of geoengineering, which is, novel ecosystem creation is definitely, unless you're strip mining and removing mountaintops,
right, or doing industrial agriculture and
or
changing the environment, which we've done for a long time.
Right, well put. And so, yeah, I guess those of us who are more sensitive to this like partnership with ecosystemic impacts and emergence, we're more cautious, I think, about creating novel ecosystems. So there's a little bit of hesitance. Now, I would argue for anybody who's very interested in ISAS, the argument is going to become self-evident that sea level rise is going to be a causative agent for ISIS, whether we precipitate it or not, whether we're the motivators or not, in certain places on the globe. And so there might be the ISAS's moment might be coming soon.
Yeah, like the entire country of Bangladesh, the entire state of Florida. We're going to need to somehow engineer how to, rectify those coastlines. So it makes sense to do it in a way that builds, ecosystem resiliency.
Yeah, so adaptation and mitigation at once.
Yeah. The other thing it reminds me of is the Living Breakwaters, which was another solution that won the Fuller Challenge. And just curious, like it's basically this idea that you can put breakwaters out from the coast and populate them with oysters and macroalgae, kelp, and other things that enables heavy storm surges from eroding the coastline. So usually with sea level rise, it's not just an incremental erosion, it's these storm surges that happen at high tides, like Hurricane Sandy in New York. And so, it seems like that's another opportunity to kind of stack functions.
Isaac, do you want to return back? I don't know if there's time, Amanda, but if Isaac had a question, I think.
No, I was Jalen actually referred to my question. I'm really in starting a modular research institution myself. What are some ways that, I was specifically talking about like tire dust pollution, but, kind of going to Jalen's question a little bit more general. I'm super interested in how we can understand how can we just start looking? Like, where do we start looking? So, yeah, thank you. And for me too, it's the social aspect. We're gonna have so much migration from urban and settings, specifically Bay Area and SoCal. How can us in the country like get out in front of it and promote empathy, I guess?
I wish I had easy answers to that one, Isaac, but I think that's why we're all here. I don't have answers, but I have commitment, and I'm actually afraid that I have to drop. I think where there's going to be some breakout and discussion, but maybe those are good provocations to work on, Isaac. I love how your mind is thinking about those kind of questions, because I think those are the potent ones for us all to sense make around and collaborate on.
Thank you so much, Kevin. This was really a beautiful deep dive into, at least a lighter dive into blue carbon.
All right. Thanks everybody.
We appreciate having you on.
What were some highlights of those conversations?
Doc R. Yeah, we got a little cut off at the end. We were just landing on the idea of the indirect line that solutions have to go through within societies and economies and politics. And so the long chain sometimes of going through channels and before something becomes an implemented policy. And it's not just about picking something that's fallen off into the bottom of the water, and it's not about preserving the coastal lines. It has to match a bit more of like the narrative of the people living over there, or who have the money or have the political influence to say, yes, well, this is part of how we want to be seen, and this is how we are the good guys of this land, and this is how we are looking ahead. And they have to weave a bit of like the solution into how they talk about themselves, and then back it up with some numbers. So So have the numbers to support the narrative of the success of change, even if the way that things have been done is narrative of success of change. So they've used the narrative of the past, and then they're like, oh, now we're going to put blue in it and just become, we are here, you know, serving the generation. Like, yeah. So we just, this is where we landed on we got cut off at the end though.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks.
Yeah, we talked about policy as well, and the trick of pilot projects, of kind of disarming people by saying like, oh, it's, you know, just a small research project or a science project, or if you can have high schoolers involved, that's even better, just to kind of disarm it, you know, just make it small and then learn by doing. Stephen, you're going to share?
Yeah, I love that idea of maybe even thinking of, you know, the pilot projects are those prototypes, the way that Tom Chi talks about rapid prototyping. It's the thing that we don't do in democracy, right? We're outsourcing our power to authorities who make decisions for us. And the actual system of democracy is actually an imposition of colonization, which is creating learned helplessness in the way we're thinking about how we integrate our actions with what nature's already doing. So it forces us back on our heels rather than, no, we're actually like, we have agency here, and we're just not using it. And so if we change the way we're thinking about our governance systems from democracy, rule of the people over nature, basically, to reciprocity with nature, with each other, with, you know, we don't take more than we need, but we also give back. And that's the thing that's missing in our economies, in our governance systems. We don't give back. It's not part of who we are, because we haven't designed that into the way we govern ourselves.
Hey, Stephen, that's so awesome. That I really appreciate your words there, and seeing how there is that gap there. You know, that's huge. That's huge just to address that. Thank you.
I mean, just get to the core of what does it mean to cooperate. And I think we haven't figured that out as human beings yet.
Yeah, and cooperate with each other and cooperate with nature as it is us too. I think is so critical. When we kind of did a review of all of the winners of a decade of the Fuller Challenge, we noticed that was a through line, was that they were all cooperating with nature, either observing the natural rhythms and accentuating them, or, you know, kind of otherwise looking to nature as design inspiration. And there's a lot of ways that we can cooperate, but that was the common line, which is part of the inspiration for this whole manual and community and movement that we're sparking today. Any other thoughts? We're going to do a little bit of a screen share here and just kind of walk you through the chapter, so you all have an idea of what's already been done here. Again, this is the first chapter, intended to be a prototype, not intended to be kind of what all the other chapters will mimic, but really one that we can have a conversation around what should the chapters include of the cooperating manual. And so, yeah, I'll pass it over to Jalen, who just joined the BFI team.
Thanks, Amanda. Thank you, everyone, because again, we couldn't do it without you. I really appreciate everyone's powerful insights. I always learn so much from being in these awesome, pretty much masterminds of different approaches and thought patterns. So really cool stuff. And let's hop right into it. Blue carbon, I'm sure we all know tons more now about the power of blue carbon. And this is available on the site if you wanted to follow along. So ultimately, what we can do is I'll just share my screen. And this is available on the Blue Carbon home site. So we're going to zoom in here. And this is, like she said, this is one instantiation of the Blue Carbon chapter. This is before the next version launched in Airtable. But Kevin did a great job of kind of touching on some of the amazing stuff in here, and as well as some of the strategies. And this is searchable as well. So if you wanted to understand like the funding attribute, you can just search it and it'll zoom in for you, which is really, really cool to help you really understand like kind of the ecosystem that is blue carbon. Or if you wanted to learn more about just the chapter, feeling free that you can click on the nodes as well. So it's very functional and has a lot of different ways of helping you like really navigate as well through the journey of what is blue carbon at its current level. So this is one of those chapters that we think will be revolutionary towards our current mission to help make the planet a little bit more inhabitable, so to speak. So it's really cool to see not only this version, but what's the possibilities here. So with that, I think I would encourage everyone to check out this site and check out at least some of the resources here and really take a deep dive to really understand at least one segment of blue carbon that is super important and imperative to you. Because there's so much here. And I love the idea that he said that we're really a spaceship water, so to speak. Because if you think about it, he has a very prevalent point. It's a very, very prevalent point there. So I'm really intrigued also to show you all like the depth and brevity of the research that he did. So if you want to check out that more as well, he also has his resource, the PDF is available here. I know some people asked for that. And this site has tons of great content and information in it. So if you ever have the time, please do check it out. And also really the state of a lot of this stuff is outlined as well on the homepage. So if any major questions come up, of course you can reach out, but make sure you do a deep dive first. And we look forward to growing this and getting you all's insights and feedback on how we can continue to collaborate and enhance and improve the experience of this chapter of the co-operating manual for Spaceship Earth.
Thanks, Jalen. Yeah, I think with the time we have remaining, we'd love to hear from you all. You know, we have a bias towards action, and we really want to make sure it's a useful manual, as manuals should be. And yeah, curious to hear from you. What would you like to see in terms of action? Like, if you're compelled to take action now, what do you need? What's in your way? And yeah, we'd love to just do kind of like a little user test with you all that are here. So anything that comes to mind, you can open up the website and take a look. There's some trim tab actions that we've included in there. And yeah, curious to hear what you all think in terms of the action orientation of this chapter.
Yeah, and if you haven't already become a member of BFI, we're hosting these cooperators Convergence weekly meetups. We're starting on April 6th at 11 a.m. Pacific Standard Time, and would love for you guys to all hop in. This is, you know, a chance for us to really design together and really build what we want to see the cooperating manual be. So if you're interested, if you want to put your name in the chat or become a member, all members are going to be automatically invited, or just become a member. We would love for you guys to be members. And it helps us to grow and continue to thrive as an organization. And we can build this manual to be so many different things.
Yeah, and also no one is turned away for lack of funds. So if money is a constraint for you, no problem at all. We have lots of scholarships thanks to some helpful donors, and yeah, really looking to just build a community and ensure that we have diversity in the community too. That's something that we keep on coming back to with this cooperating manual, is we don't want it just to be authored by a subset of the population. We really want it to be reflective of the beautiful diversity of our humanity, and that's geographically, socioeconomically, gender, race, all of the different types of beautiful diversity that we have.
we really can't do it without you all. It's very imperative that we all invite people and help people realize that it's up to us to be the change we want to see, obviously, but we're now at the time in history where it's actually possible for us to collaborate and really be that change. And stuff like this will just continue to happen and continue to inspire us. So we hope to see you in coming events and coming operations with us, and help us make this cooperating manual for Spaceship Earth or Spaceship Water.
Thank you all for coming. We really appreciate you all, and yeah, please do stay tuned, and we'll see you Wednesday, if not tonight, for the planetary session.
Yeah, thanks for cooperating.
Thank you.